April 1945. Somewhere in the Arizona desert, a German woman stood in the dust, hands raw, uniform torn, heart pounding like a drum. She had been told Americans would cut her fingers off for fun. She had been told they would starve her, beat her, break her bones one by one. She had prepared herself to die. But the man walking toward her didn't look like a monster. He wore dusty boots, a cowboy hat, a face that carried no anger. He stopped 3 feet away, looked her straight in the eyes, and said 3 words. Just 3. The guards behind him went silent. The women around her froze. Even the wind stopped moving. Those 3 words, soft, simple, almost impossible, hit harder than any bullet ever could. What did he say? And why did it make a woman raised to hate him? Cry? Stay with me. This story will change how you see war, enemies, and the power of one quiet moment. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop a like right now. It helps more than you know. And trust me, you'll want to watch this one until the very end. Let's go back to where it all began. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and fear. Traudl Kettner sat on a wooden bench in a training facility outside Munich, her spine pressed flat against the wall, her hands folded in her lap like a woman already praying. The year was 1943. She was 22 years old, a trained nurse with steady hands and a heart that had learned long ago to beat quietly. Around her sat 47 other women, nurses, auxiliaries, communications operators, all selected for deployment to the Western medical stations, all silent, all listening. The instructor was a man with no softness left in his face. His name was never spoken, only his rank, Hauptmann. He paced the front of the room like a predator measuring its cage, his boots clicking against the stone floor with the rhythm of a metronome. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. It did not need to. If you are captured by the Americans, he said, pausing to let the words settle, you will not survive. He let the silence stretch. Then he continued, they will not offer you water. They will not offer you bread. They will use you. They will break you. And when they are finished, they will discard you like refuse. Traudl did not blink. She had heard variations of this lecture before, in pamphlets, in radio broadcasts, in the whispered warnings of older nurses who had seen the front and returned hollowed. The Americans were not soldiers. They were something else. Beasts wrapped in olive drab. Machines built for cruelty. The Hauptmann clicked a switch. A projector hummed to life, throwing grainy images onto the wall. Bombed cities, burning villages, bodies in rows like felled timber. Some photographs were real. Some were staged. Traudl could not tell the difference anymore. It didn't matter. The message was the same. This is what awaits you if you fail. This is what awaits Germany if we lose. There is no surrender. There is only victory, or death with honor. By 1943, over 500,000 German women had been deployed in auxiliary roles across the Reich. Nurses, signal operators, anti-aircraft spotters, administrative clerks. They were not supposed to fight. They were not supposed to fall. But the war had stopped asking permission. The lines had blurred. And the women who once rolled bandages behind the safety of stone walls now found themselves dragged closer and closer to the teeth of combat. Traudl remembered her last night in Munich. The air had been cold, sharp with the smell of wet stone and burning coal from the train station nearby. Her mother had stood on the platform, her face pale in the lamplight, her lips pressed into a thin line that would not tremble. She did not cry. German mothers did not cry anymore. There were no tears left. Come home, her mother had said. Just that. Not stay safe, not be brave. Just come home. Traudl had nodded once, boarded the train, and never looked back. The journey to France took 4 days. The medical station was a converted farmhouse near the Belgian border, its walls pockmarked with shrapnel scars, its cellar stinking of iodine and rot. For 11 months she worked. She sewed flesh back together. She held hands while men screamed. She learned to sleep standing up, to eat without tasting, to see blood without flinching. And then the Allies came. She remembered the sound first, not gunfire, but engines. A low grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Trucks, tanks, aircraft, The sky itself had turned against them. The retreat was chaos. Her unit scattered like seeds in a storm. She ran through a forest she did not recognize, her lungs burning, her boots sinking into mud that sucked at her ankles like something alive. She didn't know when she fell. She only knew that when she stopped moving, she could not get up again. The Americans found her at dawn, curled beneath a fallen oak, her uniform soaked in someone else's blood. She waited for the shot, for the blade, for the cruelty she had been promised all her life. Instead, a young soldier with a boy's face knelt beside her, offered his canteen, and said something she did not understand. His voice was not hard. His hands did not strike. She drank, and in that single, impossible moment, everything she had ever believed began to crack. But the worst was yet to come. A ship, an ocean, and a country she had only known through nightmares. The ship was called the U.S. General Meigs. It was not built for comfort. It was built to move bodies across oceans, soldiers going one way, prisoners coming back the other. Trottle stood in a line of women on the dock in France, waiting to board. The air smelled like salt and engine oil. Gulls screamed overhead. Her wrists were tied with cloth, not wire. No one had hit her. No one had yelled. That alone felt wrong. She had expected brutality. She had prepared for it. Instead, there was only silence and procedure. The women were led up a narrow ramp into the belly of the ship. The hold was dark and hot. Metal walls, low ceilings, rows of bunks stacked 3 high, so close together you could barely sit up without hitting your head. The air was thick and hard to breathe. There were over 300 women packed into that space. German nurses, clerks, radio operators. Some had been captured in France, others in Belgium, a few from as far east as Poland. All of them had heard the same warnings. All of them believed the same lies. Trottle found a bunk near the back and sat down. The mattress was thin, barely more than canvas stretched over metal bars. She placed her small bag beside her. It held nothing but a spare shirt and a wooden comb her mother had given her years ago. Around her, women whispered in the darkness. "They're taking us to work camps." "No, execution camps." "I heard they feed us to machines." "I heard they don't feed us at all." Trottle said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than hope. The ship left port that evening. The engines roared to life beneath them, shaking the walls, rattling the bunks. Some women gasped. Others gripped the metal frames with white knuckles. Trottle closed her eyes and tried to remember what solid ground felt like. The voyage across the Atlantic took 11 days. In 1945, the United States transported over 425,000 prisoners of war across the ocean to camps on American soil. Germans, Italians, a smaller number of Japanese. Most traveled in ships like this one, converted troop carriers, stripped of anything soft or kind. The journey was not meant to break them, but it was not meant to comfort them either. Below deck, time disappeared. There were no windows, no clocks, only the rhythm of the engines and the roll of the sea. Day and night blurred together. Meals came twice a day. Thin soup, hard bread, water that tasted like rust. It was more than Trottle had eaten in weeks, but she could barely swallow it. The fear sat in her stomach like a stone. Seasickness swept through the hold like a plague. Women vomited into buckets that overflowed by morning. The smell was unbearable. Salt, sweat, bile, and something else. Despair, maybe. You could smell it in the air, heavy and sour. Some women prayed. Others cried quietly into their blankets. A few stared at the ceiling, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Trottle watched them all and wondered which one she would become. On the 4th night, the woman in the bunk above her whispered down, "Do you think it's true? What they told us?" Trottle didn't answer at first. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know. I heard they burn people alive in America. That they hate us so much, they'll do anything." Trottle had heard the same. She had seen the posters, the films, the photographs carefully selected to show American soldiers laughing over German corpses. She had been told that Americans had no honor, no soul, no mercy. But she also remembered the boy soldier who gave her water. His hands had been gentle. His eyes had been clear. "I don't know," she said again, and that was the most honest answer she had. The ship rocked. The engines groaned. Somewhere in the dark, A woman sobbed. By the 8th day, the crying had mostly stopped. The women had gone quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion. They had run out of tears. They had run out of words. Trottle lay on her bunk and stared at the rivets in the ceiling. She counted them to keep her mind from breaking. 143. She counted them again. Still 143. She thought about her mother, about Munich, about the classroom where the Hauptmann had told them they would not survive. Maybe he was right. On the 11th day, the engines changed pitch. The ship slowed. Women sat up, looking around in the dim light, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Someone shouted from above deck, words Trottle couldn't understand. Then the hatch opened. Sunlight poured in like a slap. Blinding, hot, unforgiving. "Up," a voice said in broken German. "Everyone up. We've arrived." Trottle climbed down from her bunk. Her legs shook. Her hands were cold despite the heat. She had crossed an ocean. She had survived the voyage. But now came the part she feared most. America. The heat hit her like a wall. Trottle stepped off the transport truck and into the Arizona sun. It was nothing like the heat she had known in Europe. This was dry, sharp, relentless. The air shimmered above the dirt road. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at. She blinked hard, trying to adjust. Around her vignette, the other women climbed down slowly, shielding their eyes, coughing in the dust kicked up by the wheels. This was Camp Florence, Arizona, one of over 500 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States by 1945. Most held German soldiers. A smaller number held women, nurses, auxiliaries, clerks captured in France and Belgium during the final collapse. Trottle looked around. She saw barbed wire first, rows of it, strung between wooden posts that stretched in both directions as far as she could see. But the wire didn't feel tight. It sagged in places. It looked almost lazy. Beyond the fence, the desert opened wide and empty. No trees, no buildings, just red dirt and low scrub brush and distant mountains that looked like they'd been painted onto the horizon. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like the end of the world. The guards stood waiting near the gate. That was when Trottle saw them clearly for the first time. They wore uniforms, yes, olive green shirts with patches on the shoulders. But they also wore wide-brimmed hats, the kind she had only seen in American films before the war. Their boots were scuffed and dusty. Some had leather belts with big brass buckles. One man leaned against a post, chewing something slowly, a piece of straw hanging from his mouth. They looked like cowboys. Trottle had expected soldiers, cold-faced men with rifles and anger in their eyes. She had expected dogs, whips, shouting. Instead, these men stood with their hands in their pockets. One of them nodded as the women walked past. Another tipped his hat. It made no sense. The line of women shuffled forward through the gate. No one pushed them. No one yelled. A guard with a clipboard checked names, speaking in slow, careful German. Name? Kettner. Waltraud Kettner. He wrote it down. Barrack 4. Follow the signs. That was it. No threats. No cruelty. Just paperwork. Trottle walked with the others down a dirt path between rows of wooden buildings. Everything was neat, orderly. The barracks were simple but solid, with screen doors and small windows. Laundry lines stretched between posts. A few women who had arrived earlier were already sitting outside in the shade, talking quietly. One of them waved. Trottle didn't wave back. Inside Barrack 4, the air was cooler. Rows of metal cots lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and a pillow. It wasn't soft, but it wasn't the floor either. A woman near the door, older, with gray streaks in her hair, looked up. "First day?" she asked. Trottle nodded. "It's not what they told us, is it?" Trottle said nothing. She set her bag on the cot and sat down slowly. The mattress creaked, but held. She placed her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. She didn't trust this, any of it. That evening, a bell rang, not a siren. Just a low, dull clang, like a dinner bell on a farm. The women lined up outside the mess hall. It was a long wooden building with tables inside and a serving line at the front. Trottle could smell food. Real food. Bread. Meat. Something warm. She joined the line, her stomach tight with doubt. When she reached the front, a guard handed her a metal tray. On it was a piece of bread. still warm, a ladle of stew with chunks of beef and potatoes, a cup of water, and an apple. An apple! Trottle stared at it. She hadn't seen fresh fruit in over a year. She sat at a table near the corner and looked down at the tray. Around her, other women were eating. Some slowly, some quickly. A few were crying as they chewed. Trottle picked up the spoon. Her hand shook. She took a small bite of stew. It was warm. It was real. It tasted like something her mother used to make. She set the spoon down. She couldn't eat. Not yet. Later that night, she lay on her cot and listened to the sounds of the camp. Somewhere outside, a harmonica played a slow, mournful tune. Boots crunched on gravel. A guard spoke softly to another in English, their voices low and calm. There was no screaming, no gunfire, no dogs barking. One of the women nearby whispered into the dark, "Maybe they're saving it. Maybe tomorrow they'll show us what they really are." Trottle closed her eyes. She wanted to believe that. It would be easier. It would make sense. But deep down, a small crack had already formed, because the guard who had handed her the tray had looked her in the eye, and he hadn't smiled with cruelty. He had simply nodded, the way you would to any person, and said one word she didn't need to translate. "Ma'am." She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and turned toward the wall. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would understand. Tomorrow, the mask would fall. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt warm. The cowboy who never spoke his name was Emmett Calloway. Trottle learned it on the third day, not because he told her, but because she saw it stitched in faded black thread above his shirt pocket. The letters were worn, barely visible. She stared at them while standing in line for breakfast, trying to make sense of the sounds. Emmett. The name felt slow in her mouth, like something you'd say with your boots off. He was tall, lean, with a face carved by sun and wind. His mustache was neat, but not military. His hat sat low on his head, shadowing his eyes. He moved through the camp like water, steady, unhurried, never in a rush. He didn't bark orders. He didn't carry his rifle like a threat. It hung across his back like an afterthought, as if he'd forgotten it was there. Most of the guards talked to each other constantly. Jokes, complaints, stories about home. Emmett didn't. He worked in silence. He watched without staring. And when he passed the women, he tipped his hat, just slightly, the way a man might greet a neighbor. It unnerved Trottle more than cruelty ever could. The days in Camp Florence followed a rhythm. Roll call at dawn, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments if you wanted them, laundry, kitchen help, mending uniforms. No one forced you. If you refused, nothing happened. You just sat in the shade and waited for the day to end. Trottle refused everything at first. She sat on her cot with her back straight and her hands folded. She watched the other women begin to soften, to laugh, to hum while they worked. She hated them for it. She envied them, too. By 1945, German POWs in American camps were receiving on average 4,000 calories per day, more than many American civilians. They were given medical care, recreation time, and wages for voluntary work. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but America went further. Some camps had baseball fields, libraries, even small orchestras. Trottle didn't know any of this. She only knew what she saw, and what she saw made no sense. It was on the fifth night that the blanket appeared. She had been coughing all day. The desert air was dry, and it scraped her throat raw. At night, the temperature dropped fast. The thin camp-issue blanket wasn't enough. She woke in the early hours, shivering, and found a second blanket folded at the foot of her cot. It was thicker, wool, maybe, dark gray, still warm, as if someone had just set it down. She sat up and looked around. The barrack was dark. Everyone else was asleep. No one moved. She reached out slowly and touched the fabric. It was soft, real. Her fingers curled into it. She pulled it to her chest and held it there, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. She didn't sleep. She just sat there in the dark, clutching the blanket like it might vanish if she let go. 2 days later, she found a bar of soap tucked into the fold of her uniform. It was small, wrapped in plain paper, and it smelled like lavender. Not the harsh lye soap they were given at the wash house. This was gentle, clean. She held it up to her nose and closed her eyes. It smelled like her mother's garden, like the world before the war. She didn't use it right away. She kept it hidden under her pillow, taking it out at night just to hold, just to remember what softness felt like. Then came the pencil. It appeared on her cot one afternoon while she was out at sunset. A single yellow pencil, worn down but still sharp, lying on top of a folded piece of paper. She stared at it for a long time. The other women had been writing letters home. The guards collected them every week, though no one knew if they ever arrived. Trottle had refused. What would she say? That she was alive? That she was being treated well? It felt like betrayal just to think it. But now, holding the pencil, she felt something shift. She sat down on her cot and unfolded the paper. Her hand hovered over it. Then, slowly, she began to write. Not a letter, just her name, Waltraud Kettner. The letters came out shaky at first. She hadn't written anything in months, but as the pencil moved, something loosened in her chest. Her name. Not her rank, not her number, just her name. She folded the paper carefully and slid it into her pocket, close to her heart. That evening, she saw Emmett near the fence. He was leaning against a post, hat tipped back, watching the sunset. The sky was burning orange and pink, the kind of sky that didn't care about wars or borders. She walked toward him, not planning to, just pulled by something she didn't understand. He looked up as she approached. His face didn't change. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just waited. She stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she did something she hadn't done since her capture. She nodded. Just once. A small dip of her head. It wasn't gratitude. Not yet. It was acknowledgement. He saw her. Emmett touched the brim of his hat, a slow, respectful gesture, and nodded back. No words. No demands. Just two people standing in the desert dust, recognizing each other as human. Trottle turned and walked back to the barracks. Her hands were trembling. Her throat was tight. She had been taught that kindness was a weapon, that the enemy used softness to break you, to make you weak. But this didn't feel like a trap. It felt like something far more dangerous. It felt like mercy, and she didn't know what to do with that. 3 words in the dust. It happened on a Tuesday morning, though Trottle would never remember the date, only the heat. The sun was already brutal by 9 o'clock. The sky was white with it. The women had been assigned to sort supplies near the storage shed, crates of canned goods, folded uniforms, boxes of medical bandages. It was voluntary work, but most did it anyway. It gave the hands something to do. It made the hours pass. Trottle worked in silence, lifting, stacking, moving. Sweat soaked through the back of her shirt. The air shimmered above the dirt like water. That's when she heard the sound, a soft thump, like a sack of grain hitting the ground. She turned. One of the younger women had collapsed. Her name was Annie. She was 19, thin as paper, with fever that came and went like a ghost. She had been struggling all week, but she insisted she was fine. She wasn't. Now she lay crumpled in the dust, her face pale, her lips dry and cracked. Trottle did not think. She just moved. She dropped to her knees beside the girl, her hands already checking. Pulse, breathing, temperature. The training came back like muscle memory. She had done this 100 times in field hospitals. She knew what to do. "Water?" she said sharply in German, looking up at the others. One woman ran. Another knelt beside her, eyes wide with panic. Trottle tilted Annie's head back, loosened her collar, checked her airway. The girl's skin was burning. Heat exhaustion, maybe worse. She needed shade. She needed fluids. She needed help. That's when the boots came. Heavy, steady, crunching across the gravel. Trottle looked up, squinting against the sun. It was Emmett. He walked toward them with that same calm pace. No rush, no alarm. His rifle still hung loose across his back. His hat shadowed his face, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at the girl in Trottle's arms. Then he looked at Trottle. For a moment, the world went quiet. The other women had backed away. The guards nearby had stopped talking. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Trottle's heart pounded. Her hands were still wrapped around Annie's shoulders, holding her up. She didn't know what he would do. Didn't know if helping was allowed. Didn't know if she had broken some rule she didn't understand. She braced herself. And then Emmett spoke. 3 words. Soft. steady, certain. "Ma'am, you're safe." The words hung in the air like smoke. Trottle didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. She understood the tone before she understood the meaning. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Around them, everything stopped. The guards stood frozen. The women stared, wide-eyed and silent. Even Annie, half-conscious in Trottle's arms, seemed to still. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire camp had been holding its breath, and now, suddenly, it didn't know how to let go. Trottle felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack, like ice in spring. She had been taught her entire life that capture meant suffering, that the enemy had no mercy, that survival was shame, and death was honor. She had prepared herself for pain, for cruelty, for humiliation, but no one had prepared her for this. No one had told her that a man in a cowboy hat would kneel beside her in the desert dust, lift a dying girl from her arms with hands that were gentle, and speak to her like a, she mattered. Emmett bent down and carefully scooped Annie into his arms. The girl's head rolled against his shoulder. He stood slowly, adjusting her weight, making sure she was secure. Then he looked at Trottle again. "Come," he said quietly, nodding toward the infirmary. She stood on shaking legs and followed. They walked across the camp in silence. Trottle's hands were still trembling. Her mind was spinning. She kept replaying the words. "Ma'am, you're safe. Not prisoner. Not enemy. Not even her name. Ma'am, a word of respect. A word you used for someone who deserved dignity." Inside the infirmary, Emmett laid Annie on a cot. A medic came quickly, checking her pulse, giving her water, placing a cool cloth on her forehead. Trottle stood nearby, watching, her arms hanging useless at her sides. Emmett stepped back, gave the medic space, then turned to Trottle. He didn't say anything else. He just touched the brim of his hat, a small gesture, and walked out. Trottle stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The medic spoke to her in broken German. "She'll be okay. You did good." Trottle nodded, but she didn't hear him. Her mind was somewhere else. She was thinking about the Hauptmann, about the classroom in Munich, about the warnings, the lectures, the promises of horror. She was thinking about her mother's face on the train platform. She was thinking about the 11 days on the ship, the fear, the certainty that she was sailing toward her death. And she was thinking about 3 words spoken by a cowboy in the Arizona sun. "Ma'am, you're safe." Kindness, she realized, was more powerful than cruelty. Cruelty confirmed what you already believed. It made you harder. It made you hide. But kindness, real, quiet, unexpected kindness, shattered everything. It left you defenseless. That night, she sat on her cot with the pencil and paper in her lap. Around her, the other women whispered and slept. Outside, the desert was cool and still. She began to write. Not to her mother, not to anyone, just to herself. She wrote about the collapse, about Emmett's hands, about the silence that followed his words. And for the first time since her capture, she let herself cry. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of being seen as human. The letter took her 3 nights to write. She sat on her cot after lights out, a candle stub flickering beside her, the pencil moving slowly across the page. Around her, women slept or whispered. Outside, the desert wind hummed through the wire. She wrote to her mother, not about the war, not about the capture, or the ship, or the fear. She wrote about the blanket, about the soap that smelled like lavender, about the cowboy who tipped his hat and called her ma'am. She wrote about the 3 words that had broken something inside her. He said I was safe, Mama, and I believed him. Her handwriting was small and careful. She crossed out sentences, rewrote them, tried to find words that could carry the weight of what she felt. It was impossible, but she tried anyway. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, she handed it to the guard at the collection box. He took it without looking at her, added it to the stack, and moved on. She never knew it would never leave the camp. All letters written by German POWs were opened, read, and reviewed by military censors. Some were sent on. Others were filed away in boxes marked with dates and camp numbers. Trottle's letter was one of thousands that never crossed the ocean. It sat in a storage facility in Virginia for 40 years before being destroyed in a routine purge. Her mother never read it, never knew her daughter had been safe, never knew about Emmett Calloway or the quiet mercy of a cowboy in the desert. But Trottle didn't know that. For months, she believed the letter was on its way, and that belief, even if it was false, gave her something to hold on to. In August 1945, the war ended. The news came over the radio in the mess hall. The women gathered around, silent, staring at the speaker as the voice announced Germany's unconditional surrender. Some cried. Others sat in stunned silence. A few simply walked outside and stared at the sky. Trottle felt nothing. The war had already ended for her the day Emmett knelt in the dust. By November, the repatriation ships began to leave. One by one, the camps emptied. The women were processed, photographed, given travel documents, and loaded onto trucks headed for the coast. Trottle stood at the gate of Camp Florence on a cold morning, her small bag in her hand, the wool blanket folded inside. She looked back once at the barracks, the mess hall, the fence. She looked for Emmett, but he wasn't there. His shift had ended the night before. She would never see him again. The ship back to Europe was faster, cleaner, but it felt longer. Germany was unrecognizable. The cities were rubble. The streets were filled with hollow-eyed people searching for food, for family, for anything left to hold. Trottle returned to Munich and found her childhood home reduced to half a wall and a pile of bricks. Her mother was alive, thin, gray, aged 10 years in 2. When she saw Trottle standing in the doorway, she didn't cry. She just pulled her daughter into her arms and held her. "You came home," she whispered. Trottle nodded into her shoulder. "I came home." They rebuilt. Slowly. A room. A roof. A life. Trottle worked as a nurse again, this time in a clinic that operated out of a church basement. She married a quiet man who had lost his arm in the war. They had a daughter. They named her Matilda. For years, Trottle didn't speak about the camp. Not to her husband. Not to her friends. It felt too strange. Too fragile. Like something that would shatter if spoken aloud. But one night, decades later, when Matilda was 16 and the world had moved on, the story came out. They were sitting at the kitchen table. Matilda had asked a simple question about America, about the war, about what it had been like. And Trottle, for the first time, told her. She told her about the ship, about the desert, about the cowboy named Emmett, who never raised his voice and always tipped his hat. She told her about the 3 words. Matilda listened, eyes wide, her tea growing cold in her hands. "He really said that?" she asked. "You're safe?" Trottle nodded. "He did. And you believed him?" Trottle smiled. It was a soft smile, the kind that carried weight. "Yes," she said. "I believed him." Matilda was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Did you ever see him again?" Trottle shook her head. "No, but I never forgot him." That night, after her daughter had gone to bed, Trottle sat by the window and looked out at the street. The city had been rebuilt. The scars were still there, but life had returned. She thought about Emmett, about the blanket, about the letter that never arrived. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he remembered the woman who collapsed in the dust, if he knew what those 3 words had done. Probably not. To him, it was just another day, just another act of decency in a world that had forgotten what decency looked like. But to her, it was everything. Because in the end, wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by the choices people make when no one is watching. By the small acts of kindness that plant seeds in hearts hardened by hate. Emmett Calloway never fired a shot at Trottle Kettner. He never needed to. He defeated her with 3 words, and in doing so, he gave her back her life. The story of Trottle Kettner and Emmett Calloway is not unique. Across hundreds of POW camps in America during World War II, thousands of small moments like this one played out in silence.